taking time for your health. The African American Wellness Watch. Trusted information for us, by us. Dr. Mike LeNoir and other experts from around the country and around the world have the latest on how you and your family can get healthy and stay well. It's time for the African American Wellness Watch. A famous philosopher once said, if you don't know your history, then you're doomed to repeat it. Well, the Wellness Watch takes that admonition really quite seriously. So all this month, Black History Month, we will focus on health disparities that affect African Americans in a unique way. We will look to their historical underpinnings in hopes of finding strategies to address and eventually eliminate health disparities. And we're honored to have world experts to help us on this. First is Samantha Artiga. She's the vice president for KFF, which used to be known as the Kaiser Family Foundation, and that's the nation's premier independent source for health policy. Ms. Artiga is the author of a recent paper on the historical roots of health disparities. Ms. Artiga, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And of course, we have our host, Dr. Mike LeNoir, who through his 40 plus years of practice has fought to overcome health disparities that he's seen in almost every day, both personally and professionally. Mike, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Among some of the most glaring of health disparities are the incidences of asthma and lead poisoning among African Americans, especially African American children. Dr. LeNoir, let's sort of start off this conversation about the social determinants of health, if you will. What rings true in your more than 40 years of practice as far as the folks coming in with asthma and where they live, and have you been able to sort of link the two?
Oh, I think there's any question, George. If you look at statistics, asthma is a pretty lethal disease for African Americans. Every year, every day, 10 people die from asthma, and disproportionately African Americans. African American child is the third more likely to have hospitalizations, and even greater in terms of statistics on mortality. And because asthma is such an external disease, by that I mean asthma is a disease of triggers. That means if you have the problem, obviously that problem settles in and becomes a baseline for you. But whether or not you have the manifestations of asthma have a lot to do with the triggers that stimulate the airway to close and stimulate already kind of the sensitive airway. So where you live is critically important. Number of studies, we've done some, everybody's done some, that if you live in an environment where there's poverty, there's violence, there's food insecurity, your asthma is going to be worse. If you live near a freeway, so many places are, or if you look at environmental, from an environmental justice perspective, so many African-American communities in large cities are near dumps and chemical plants and areas like that. So the external factors are probably more a trigger for asthma as a chronic disease than for any other medical problem.
And these external factors, Ms. Artiga, a lot of them have come about not just because of regular city planning, but because of a racial tinge or racial motivation to some of the city planning, right?
Yeah, so as Dr. LeNoir mentions, I think one of the most significant factors that determines our health is where we live. And today we really see ongoing residential segregation with a large share of the Black population living in urban areas that have less access to many of the resources that support health and that pose more exposure to many environmental health risks, such as the examples that Dr. LeNoir mentioned. And this segregation that we see today is a reflection of past policies, in particular redlining, which was in place in the 1930s under legislation in which residential neighborhoods were graded based on their perceived mortgage risk. And higher risk neighborhoods were marked in red, the origination of that term redlining. One of the factors that was used in grading these neighborhoods was the racial makeup of them. And so Black neighborhoods were more likely to be redlined. That made it more difficult for people living in those neighborhoods to access mortgage loans. And at the same time, they were prohibited from purchasing in the newly developing suburbs at that time. And while the Fair Housing Act passed later in the 1960s, eventually prohibiting discrimination in housing, by then many Black families were priced out of the suburban housing market. And today, the housing patterns we see continue to reflect those past policy decisions.
And I think it was in the 70s or the 80s. Wasn't there a law passed to in effect build more hospitals? And a lot of that hospital money got taken to white neighborhoods instead of neighborhoods where they were most needed, right?
Right. So there was legislation passed to support the development of hospitals, but at that time, we were still operating under a separate but equal idea. So many of the hospitals that were developed still were segregated and left Black people without access to hospital care.
The term for these so-called outside forces is social determinants of health. You can see them right here in this slide. All of these things here affect our health, economic stability. Do we have the money to pay for care? What's our neighborhood like? Is it close to pollution? Are there buses to take us where we need to go? Do we have enough education to understand completely what a provider may be telling us to do? Do we have fresh, healthy food available? Or are there more McDonald's than supermarkets in our neighborhoods? Is our neighborhood safe? Gun violence is a public health problem. And finally, is the healthcare system where we live attuned to our needs? Anger that probably hides the recognition that racial stereotypes can and do affect too many medical decisions made by individual practitioners and, frankly, the healthcare system. But the interrelationship of how we live, where we live, and what support systems we have to our overall health, I think gives us a new paradigm on, frankly, how to fight back. Puts new energy into the advocacy for better schools, better policing, gun control, economic empowerment. Frankly, all of it is about our health.
Nobody's really happy with the healthcare system that we have. And so consequently, I think that it's still not so much it's a two-phase problem. First of all, it's about the triggers we talked about. Secondly, it's about the way in which they're managed. What I've seen through the years and what has disturbed me the most is I've seen African-American children and adults managed so elementary by the same practitioners who engage in a deep dive on patients who are not poor and not Black. I think one of the biggest problems in asthma, nobody should die from asthma. Nobody really should be hospitalized with asthma because we have so many effective ways to manage it. But if I look at the casual way in which the healthcare system treats people of color and the underserved, I mean, not just Black people, people don't have the same resources, as opposed to the deep dive they make for patients who are in more affluent neighborhoods. It's an embarrassment, and it makes me angry. And one of the good things about social determinants now is that people are starting to realize that racism, being Black, not only makes you tired, but makes you anxious and keeps you sick.
I think I remember not too long ago reading a piece about high blood pressure and how African Americans historically have had more of a problem with hypertension, and these researchers were saying that some of it is due to anxiety. That is anxiety about living in a racist world. Samantha, have you seen some of that in your research as well?
Yeah.
And is there a historical link to some of this, do you think?
I mean, we saw this in some of our recent survey findings. We conducted a survey just this past summer in 2023, and that had findings that were consistent with some of the existing research, really demonstrating the link between experiences with racism and health and well-being. So in particular, adults who had more experiences with discrimination in daily life were more likely than those who did not to report feelings of anxiety, loneliness, and depression. We also seeing them reporting worse overall mental health and well-being. So there is a link between experiences with discrimination and health more directly beyond a lot of these social and economic factors that we talked about.
When you present this kind of data to policymakers, what's their reaction?
Well, I think, there's a variety of levels of knowledge in terms of where we are about disparities and the role of racism and discrimination and social and economic indicators in terms of driving health. So I think there remains a diverse range in terms of where people are in their knowledge and understanding of these concepts. Overall, our work is trying to move people forward in a place of understanding of the extent to which racism and discrimination continue to impact people's everyday lives, and in particular, their healthcare experiences and health. And hoping that that increased knowledge and understanding of those measures will help to drive policymakers to more directly address some of the issues.
And Dr. LeNoir, when you have these conversations with your fellow physicians, what's their reaction to it?
Very interesting. I take it back a couple of years ago. I belonged to a very premium health plan. I'm old enough to have joined all these plans when they started. And they had an interesting meeting at a major upscale hotel here, in which all of the physicians were invited in that plan. And they had as a guest a woman who talked about this issue of disparities. And it was interesting. It was not a learning experience for a lot of these physicians. It made them angry. Like, it's not me that's doing this. I don't understand how you can say that the system is racist because I'm not doing it. I do the same. I provide the same care for Mrs. Johnson or Mrs. Hockenstraw as I do for Annie. And so right there, you kind of get a sense. But it was mostly anger that they were being accused of being racist, when quite clearly I was lucky enough to have an allergy referral service that saw hundreds of children a year from different practices. And I can tell you the differences of how Black patients were treated from the same practices was striking. But the response was angry, or it's not me, or I didn't do it, or I had no slaves, same kind of thing.
Exactly, but trust can be and is often ephemeral, especially when it has to be earned following years of distrust. Well, frankly, it's no wonder that doctors like Dr. LeNoir have little problem getting patients to try something new.
Because I think the pandemic, or the George Floyd and the pandemic, really made the country more sensitive to the issues of health inequity. The differences between certainly the deaths early on in the pandemic, disproportionately African American, sensitized the country to a new dynamic. I've always watched these dynamics ebb and flow, and I think we're starting to lose a little footing on this health equity issue as other issues rise to take their place. But I do believe that there is a different vision of the kinds of issues that really impact on the health of African Americans, and there is an attempt in almost all parts of the country to address those in an organized way. I think the inclusion of racism as a major factor in disease, I think, is probably pretty much accepted now. And I look forward to a new era of research, clinical research, and educational focus on the issue of race as a dynamic and as a way to solve a problem that a whole community, let me say, I have to say it this way, that a whole community that is perceived as Black, has problems.
I think that's a perfect way to end this segment. Dr. LeNoir, thank you very much. Samantha Artiga, thank you very much. This is the second program in our series long look at the historical roots to current health disparities. That's on the African American Wellness Watch and on our website as well. Dr. LeNoir, you want to take us off?
No, just once again, thanks to Ms. Artiga and the Kaiser Family Foundation for the information they provide and their continued interest in fairness and equity. And I'd like to thank those of you who've taken the time to look at this program. And remember, as we always are concerned, health is your biggest asset. So please protect it.